My name is Josie Tanner. I'm 37 years old, and on a rainy Tuesday morning in Knoxville, Tennessee, I was standing on a step stool in my late grandmother's attic, pulling cardboard boxes toward me one at a time, when my hand touched something that wasn't a box. A tin. Flat. Rectangular. The kind that used to hold Christmas cookies, painted red with a faded poinsettia on the lid. I almost set it aside. I almost put it in the donation pile and climbed down and went back to the kitchen where my sister-in-law Diane was already cataloging the furniture with the focused energy of someone who has decided something belongs to them. But something made me open it. Inside was a letter. 4 pages, handwritten, my grandmother's cursive, the specific, looping, careful handwriting of a woman who had learned penmanship in a one-room schoolhouse in rural Tennessee in 1952 and never saw any reason to write any other way. The letter was addressed to me. Not to the family, not to my brother, not to Diane, who had spent the 3 weeks since my grandmother's death positioning herself as the primary decision-maker for an estate she had no legal claim to. To me, Josie, by name. And what was in those 4 pages, what my grandmother had written in the winter before she died, sealed in a Christmas cookie tin and placed in the back corner of her attic where only someone looking carefully would find it, ended every conversation Diane had been having about the $200,000 my grandmother had left behind. Every single one. Before I tell you everything, please like and subscribe if this story speaks to you. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I want to know where you're listening from tonight. Now let me take you back to the beginning. To understand the letter, you need to understand my grandmother. My grandmother's name was Edna Pearl Tanner. She was 83 years old when she died. She was born in a farmhouse outside Maryville, Tennessee, the 3rd of 7 children, and she spent her entire life in the same 40-mile radius where she had drawn her first breath. She married my grandfather Harold in 1961. He died in 2008. She spent the 15 years after his death, quietly, carefully, and on her own terms. She was not a woman who needed a lot of noise around her. She was 5'2", weighed maybe 110 pounds, and had the specific authority of someone who has never once raised her voice, because she has never needed to. When Edna Pearl Tanner wanted you to understand something, she looked at you in a particular way and said exactly one sentence, and the sentence was enough. She taught me to bake. She taught me to sew a button. She taught me that a handwritten letter was worth 10 phone calls, and that the people who mattered most in your life deserved the effort of your actual handwriting. She was also, quietly, careful with money in the way that people of her generation often were, people who had watched their parents lose things in bad years and decided early that security was something you built and maintained and did not hand over carelessly. She had been saved for decades, slowly and consistently, and without ever making a production of it. When her estate was opened after her death, the total value was $200,000. Savings accounts, a small investment portfolio she had managed herself with the help of a financial advisor she had seen twice a year for 20 years. The house on Maple Creek Road, which she had owned free and clear since 1979. $200,000. My grandmother had no children. She never had children of her own. She was my father's aunt, his mother's sister, which made her my great-aunt technically, though I had never called her anything but Grandma Edna my entire life. My father died when I was 11. His sister, my Aunt Patricia, had died 4 years later. My mother remarried and moved to Phoenix when I was 19. My family had contracted and scattered in the way that families sometimes do, and Edna had been the constant, the one who was always there, the one whose kitchen I knew as well as my own. My brother, Daniel, technically my half-brother from my father's first marriage, had a complicated relationship with Edna. He was older than me by 8 years. He left Tennessee at 22 and came back sporadically. He and Edna were connected by blood, but not by the daily fabric of things. He called her on holidays. She sent him cards. Daniel married Diane 6 years ago. Diane is the kind of woman who enters a room and immediately assesses its value. I do not mean that as a metaphor. I need to tell you about Diane. She grew up in Nashville, came from a family with more aspiration than means, and spent her adult life in careful pursuit of the gap between those two things. She was attractive, well-dressed, and socially precise in a way that required effort she never let you see. She was also, once she understood that Edna had money, relentlessly interested in Edna. The transformation happened gradually. In the first 2 years of Daniel's marriage, Diane barely acknowledged Edna's existence. She came to one Thanksgiving, spent most of it on her phone, and left early citing a headache. Then she learned about the investment portfolio. I don't know exactly when or how she found out, but I know that in year 3 of the marriage, Diane suddenly became very interested in visiting Knoxville. She started calling Edna. She sent flowers on her birthday, elaborate arrangements from an expensive florist that looked nothing like anything Edna would have chosen for herself. She started referring to Edna as Grandma in conversation. Edna never corrected her, but Edna noticed. I know she noticed because of 4 pages of careful cursive in a Christmas cookie tin. The 3 weeks after the funeral. Edna died on a Wednesday morning in late October, peacefully, at home, the way she had planned. She had told me 6 months earlier, in her kitchen over coffee, that she was not afraid of dying and that I should not make a fuss, and that the azaleas in the front bed needed cutting back before winter. I cut the azaleas back. The funeral was small. Edna had outlived most of her friends. 40 people, maybe 50, at the church she had attended for 60 years. Her neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, her financial advisor, Gerald, a few people from the historical society she'd volunteered with, my brother Daniel, and Diane. Diane wore black, expensive black. She stood next to Daniel with her hand on his arm and her eyes moving carefully around the room in a way that had nothing to do with grief. 3 days after the funeral, Diane called me. "We need to get to the house," she said. "There's a lot to go through, and Daniel and I want to make sure things are organized properly. The estate attorney handles the formal distribution, Margaret Hale. Edna chose her herself." "Of course," Diane said, "but the personal items, the furniture, the household things, that's a family decision." Family decision? I agreed to meet them at the house the following Saturday. When I arrived, Diane was already there. She had brought a notebook. She was walking through the rooms with the notebook open, writing things down. I stood in the doorway and watched her open the door of my grandmother's china cabinet and examine a set of dishes that had been in the family since 1947. "These are beautiful," she said, not looking up. "Daniel's mother would have wanted him to have these." Daniel's mother had died 12 years earlier and had never been inside this house. Those were Edna's mother's dishes. She'd want them to stay in the family. "We are family," Diane said. She wrote something in the notebook. Over the following 2 weeks, Diane constructed a narrative. The narrative went like this. My grandmother had been close to Daniel, had always considered him her primary family connection, and had spoken often about wanting him to be taken care of, and would have wanted the bulk of her estate to reflect that closeness. She told this to Daniel. She told it to Margaret Hale, Edna's estate attorney, in a phone call she made without telling me. She told it to two of Edna's neighbors, framing it as a simple statement of fact. She told it to Gerald, Edna's financial advisor, when she called his office to ask, with no legal standing to do so, about the account structure. She was building a case. Not a legal case, exactly, a social one. A version of events that, if repeated enough times to enough people, would become the assumed context for whatever came next. I knew what she was doing. I didn't yet have anything to counter it. Then I went to the attic. I need to pause here for a second, because I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone rewrite a story about a person you loved, not with obvious lies, just with selective emphasis, careful omission, strategic framing, and felt the helplessness of knowing the truth while watching the false version take hold? That's where I was for 2 weeks. Drop the word rewriting in the comments if you know that feeling, and stay with me, because my grandmother was smarter than Diane gave her credit for. She always was. The attic. I was there on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the funeral. Margaret had asked me to begin inventorying the personal property before the estate formally opened. Diane had offered to help. Diane was downstairs. I was in the attic alone, working through the boxes, when my hand found the tin. I opened it. The letter was folded twice, my name on the outside in Edna's handwriting. I sat down on the attic floor, on the old braided rug Edna had kept up there since the 1990s, and I read what the letter said. I am going to tell you what Edna wrote the way Edna wrote it, plainly, without decoration, because that was how she communicated, and it deserves to be honored in the telling. She began by explaining why she had written a letter instead of making certain things explicit in her formal will. She said she had discussed the financial distribution with Margaret and that the legal documents were already clear and already filed. She had written the letter not for legal purposes, but for human ones, because she knew, she said, that legal documents don't stop people from arguing about what they think they deserve, and she wanted certain things on record in her own words. She wrote about me first. She wrote that I had been present in her life in a way that she did not take for granted, that I drove to Knoxville 17 times in the last 3 years to help with doctor's appointments, yard work, repairs, and the general maintenance of a life that was becoming more complicated to manage alone. She wrote that I never once asked her for anything in return, and that she had noticed this, specifically, because it was uncommon. She wrote, Josie never made me feel like a resource. She made me feel like a person. There is a difference, and not everyone understands it. Then she wrote about Diane. She wrote about it directly, without cruelty, in the way that women of her generation handled uncomfortable truths, by naming them quietly and completely. She wrote that she had noticed the change in Diane's behavior when Diane had learned about the investment portfolio. She noted the approximate date she believed she had found out, based on when the phone calls and flower deliveries had begun. She noted that prior to that date, Diane had attended one family event in 3 years and had not initiated contact of any kind. She wrote, I am old, not stupid, and I have seen enough of human nature to recognize the difference between affection and appetite. She wrote that she had discussed her concerns with Margaret, and that Margaret had helped her structure the estate documents to be explicit and unambiguous precisely because she had anticipated a challenge. Then she wrote the most important paragraph. She wrote that the $200,000 in savings and investment accounts was to be distributed in its entirety to me, that the house on Maple Creek Road was to be sold and the proceeds split equally between me and a historical preservation society she had supported for 20 years. She wrote that Daniel was to receive her father's pocket watch and a specific set of woodworking tools that had belonged to Harold because she knew he would appreciate them and they had no monetary value to dispute. She wrote, Daniel is a good man who married a woman who makes decisions for him. I have no quarrel with Daniel, but I will not let Diane make decisions for my estate. She closed the letter with something I have read probably 40 times since that Tuesday morning on the attic floor. She wrote, You were the one who came when I needed someone to come. Not because you expected anything, because you are the kind of person who comes. I have always known that about you. Make something beautiful with this. Your grandfather would have liked that." She signed it, Grandma Edna. I sat on that attic floor for a long time. Then I heard Diane's footsteps on the stairs. Diane came into the attic. She saw me on the floor. She saw the tin. She saw the letter in my hands. Her eyes went to the letter immediately. "What's that?" she said. "A letter," I said. "From Edna. To me." She crossed the attic. She held out her hand. Not asking, expecting. I looked at her hand. "It's addressed to me," I said. "I'd like to see it." "No," I said. She held her hand there for another moment, then she lowered it. "Is it about the estate?" she said. "It's personal correspondence from my grandmother," I said. "Addressed to me, by name." I put the letter back in the tin. I stood up. I carried the tin downstairs. I called Margaret Hale from my grandmother's kitchen, while Diane stood in the doorway. "Margaret," I said. "I found a letter in the attic, Edna's handwriting, addressed to me. I think you should see it." Margaret's voice was immediate. "Can you bring it today?" she said. Margaret had been expecting something like this. Not the letter specifically, but she told me, when I sat in her office 2 hours later, that Edna had indicated there might be additional personal documentation that would support the estate's structure. She was very deliberate, Margaret said. She spent a great deal of time making sure her intentions were absolutely clear. Margaret read the letter carefully. She made a copy with my permission. She placed it in the estate file. "This is consistent with every instruction Edna gave me," she said. "The distribution she describes matches the formal documents exactly. This letter doesn't change the legal outcome, but it explains the reasoning in her own words. That matters if anyone challenges the estate." "Diane is going to challenge it," I said. Margaret looked at me. "She has no standing to challenge it. She is not a named party. She is not a beneficiary. She is the spouse of someone who received specific personal items of sentimental value. The financial estate is unambiguous." "She doesn't know that yet," I said. "She's about to," Margaret said. The estate meeting was the following Thursday. Margaret's office, Daniel and Diane on one side of the conference table, me on the other, Margaret at the head. Margaret distributed copies of the estate summary. Clean, clear, numbered. Every asset listed, every distribution specified. Diane scanned it in approximately 4 seconds. Her eyes went to the savings and investment accounts, to the number, to the beneficiary line. Josie Ann Tanner, 100%. She looked up. "This isn't right," she said. "It is correct. These are Edna's instructions as documented with counsel over a period of 2 years and additionally supported by a personal letter Edna wrote and placed in her home for Josie to find." She placed a copy of the letter on the table. Diane picked it up. I watched her read it. I watched her read the paragraph about the change in phone calls and flower deliveries and the date Diane learned about the portfolio. I watched her read, "I am old, not stupid." She set the letter down. She did not speak for a long moment. Daniel picked up the letter. He read it quietly. When he finished, he folded it and placed it back on the table. He looked at Diane. Something passed between them that I was not supposed to see. Then he looked at me. "Josie," he said, "I'm sorry." Not for the estate, I understood that, for what had been done with his name attached to it. "It's okay, Daniel," I said. Diane did not speak again during that meeting. She did not challenge the estate. The house sold in February. The Historical Society received their portion. I received mine. The $200,000 sat in an account for 3 months while I thought about what Edna had written. Make something beautiful with this. Your grandfather would have liked that. Harold had been a woodworker. He had built furniture in his garage for 40 years. He had built the kitchen table where Edna had drunk her coffee every morning since 1974. I bought a house. Not a large house, a 1940s bungalow on a tree-lined street in Knoxville, 20 minutes from where Edna had lived. It needed work. Real work. The kitchen needed gutting, the floors needed refinishing, the back porch was structurally unsound. I am doing most of it myself. Not because I have to, because I want to understand what it means to put something back together with your own hands. Because Edna spent 83 years building and maintaining things, and I want to understand, in a physical sense, what that means. The kitchen table from Edna's house is in my kitchen now, the one Harold built. I have my coffee at it every morning. Daniel called me in March. We talked for 40 minutes. It was the longest conversation we'd had in years. He told me that Diane had been the one pushing the narrative, that he had been uncomfortable with it but hadn't known how to say so. He said finding out about the timeline in Edna's letter, the specific documentation of when the behavior had started, had been difficult to read. She knew exactly what was happening, I said. She always did. She just chose her timing. She chose you, he said. She'd been watching both of us our whole lives. She chose you. I said, she left you Harold's watch. He was quiet. I've been wearing it every day. Daniel and Diane are still married. I don't know what their private conversations about this have looked like. I don't need to know. What I do know is that Daniel calls now. Not every week, but regularly. And Diane does not call at all. That is its own kind of resolution.
There is something I want to say about my grandmother. She did not write that letter as revenge. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to read it that way. Edna named Diane's behavior specifically and precisely and with dates. That could look like score settling. It wasn't. Edna wrote that letter because she understood something about the difference between what people say and what people do. She had watched Diane say all the right things and do something different underneath them. She had watched me say very little and show up 17 times in 3 years. She documented the truth because she knew the truth would be argued with. She put it in a Christmas cookie tin in the back corner of her attic because she knew I would be the one going through her things, carefully, the way you go through the things of someone you love, rather than someone whose estate you're assessing. She knew I would find it. She knew Diane would not be the one looking. That is not revenge. That is a woman who spent 83 years paying attention to who people actually were and making her decisions accordingly. I want to be like that when I am 83. I want to have that kind of clarity. I want to ask you something before I go. Edna wrote, Josie never made me feel like a resource. She made me feel like a person. I have thought about that sentence almost every day since I read it. Because I think most of us, when we show up for someone we love, when we drive to their appointments and help with their yard and sit with them in the ordinary days rather than just the significant ones, we don't do it with any expectation of return. We do it because they matter to us. But here is what I've been sitting with. Edna noticed. She tracked it. She documented it with the same careful attention she had given everything in her life for 83 years. And I wonder how many people in our lives are noticing the same way she was, quietly, without telling us, and how different our choices would look if we understood that the people we love are always paying closer attention than we think. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever shown up for someone without expecting anything and had it matter in a way you didn't anticipate? Tell me that story. I read every single one. And if you have someone older in your life, someone who has been there in the steady, unremarkable, daily way, call them this week. Not for any reason, just because they notice. My grandmother left me $200,000 and a kitchen table and 4 pages of careful cursive in a Christmas cookie tin. The $200,000 bought me a house. The letter told me who I was. The kitchen table is where I have my coffee every morning. I think Harold would have liked that. I think Edna would too. Subscribe, because next week I'm sharing what Edna's financial advisor, Gerald, told me about a conversation he had with Diane 3 weeks before the estate meeting, and what Edna had already told him to say.